This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. We are out in the bucolic, beautiful countryside and some sort of right next to the King Wine Estate, south of Eugene, Oregon, and I'm at Alesong Brewing and Blending. And Matt and Brian have joined me. Welcome to the podcast, Matt Van Wyk, Brian Coombs.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me out here. It's been what a beautiful location.
Yeah, we picked a good day.
Sitting
nice
outside on the patio, there's animals, farm animals off in the distance, wine grapes over the hill. We're enjoying some beautiful mixed fermentation beer right now. You all focus on barrel-aged beers aged in wood, both on the sour and the clean side. We're going to talk a lot about that today, and I'm excited to dive into both of those things with you. And, as I was checking it out, it's like you somehow have won 9 GABF medals, right, between the time you founded and today. A lot in that sour and mixed Brett beer, mixed fermentation category, but also clean barrel aged beer as well. We're going to talk about how you do that. That's it's going to be a fun thing to talk about. Before we do that, for nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. G&D stands above the rest as the only chiller manufacturer that engineers your glycol piping for free. G&D also stands alone as the only chiller manufacturer with an in-house team of installers and engineers with 30 years of real-world field labor experience in breweries, wineries, and distilleries. Contact the Total Glycol System Design experts today at gdchillers.com. Yeah, we're actually out in GD Chillers country here in Oregon. I mean, they're
heck yeah, we have 2 of those.
You do?
Yeah. And our original warehouse was walking distance from where they build them, so it's lucky. They can fix things real quick.
Yeah, it's great.
Fantastic. We've all, of course, have appreciated their long-term support of the podcast. Also, still emptying those overflowing waste bins full of low fills, crushed and damaged cans, or undercarbonated beer every canning day. It's time to fill like a pro. Email contact us at probrew.com for more information on ProFill can fillers from ProBrew. ProFill can fillers use rotary, true counter-pressure, gravity filling, and seaming technology to run at speeds of 100 to 300 cans per minute with less than 30 parts per billion DO pickup and less than 1% product waste at the filler. Stop wasting perfectly good beer. Email ProBrew at contactus@probrew.com today. ProBrew is a subsidiary of Technoblend, now a ProMock brand. So Matt, where was that moment where beer clicked for you? And then how did that turn into that one question that everyone faces where I want to do this for a career? And then how did it move from career then to, hey, let's start our own brewery out here?
Yeah, so I've been at this collecting a paycheck for 21 years now, so I've been doing a little bit. And I started after college as a science teacher, and I was in the Chicago suburbs. And that was fine. It was a nice career. But I was starting to drink some imported beers because there wasn't that much craft beer. And this is the late 90s. And I started a homebrew with a friend. And suddenly that's when it clicked, when I was homebrewing and realizing how beer was made. Having a science-related degree, glycolysis and cellular respiration, that's not very exciting. And I didn't even know what it was for until I discovered fermentation and made my own beer. And then I said, that was when the light bulb went on. And I'm like, oh, this is crazy. Glycolysis is cool. I'm sure Brian will think that's funny because he's got a science degree and has done biology and chemistry for his whole career. So anyway, that's when I realized the science that I had been studying was cool in fermentation.
You found a value add for that science.
I did. And so I got into homebrewing a little bit and got into finding some craft beer and things like that. And long story short, I was having some time off as a teacher in summer break, winter break, spring break, and I went into a small brew pub in the west suburbs of Chicago and asked a now friend of mine if I could just help him wash kegs, mash in, do the grunt work, whatever it took. And suddenly I realized, wow, someone pays you for this? You can make a career out of brewing? It kind of blew my mind. And so I would help every break I had. And it was just a hobby. It was kind of a big homebrew system, pretty much. And I started to always go there whenever I had a chance to help him make beer. And finally he said, you're working harder than my assistant, and I pay him. I just give you some beer now and again, or lunch at the pub. And he said, would you like a job? And because I was working on my master's in teaching, because I was trying to make it a career, I said no. But after I kept coming back, it was the right time in my life to be able to say, yeah, let's just try it. And so the initial plan was to be an assistant brewer for this guy at a small little brew pub for 2 years, and then go back to teaching. And then before you know it, I'm the head brewer of another small pub, and then that place closes down. I go to another pub, and then before you know it, I'm in Oregon brewing at Oakshire Brewing. And
he left out a GABF Small Brewer of the Year in there too.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we won some. In 2006, I was a Small Brew Pub Brewer of the Year at GABF, and it was certainly a different time in our industry. Right. I don't want to say it was easier to win awards, but there were less entries. Let's just say that.
Sure.
And that kind of put me on the map as a professional brewer, and got me noticed for different jobs, and it sort of jump started my career to be able to do what I wanted to do rather than just be an assistant brewer washing kegs.
Sure.
So that's kind of how I got into it and stuck with it.
Where'd you start, Brian?
Yeah, so I went to U of O here in Eugene, and my senior year, I was kind of on the track to graduate in 3 years, and then I got a scholarship, and so my fourth year ended up being pretty easy. I just had a few classes working in the lab, and then I was like really getting into craft beer because this is in 2010 when Ninkasi here in town was getting really big, and then Oakshire as well was getting big. And it's like getting hard alcohol in Oregon is difficult because you have to go to a liquor store and then close early, whatever. So in college, everyone drank beer, and it was like in Eugene, there was this beer culture, and it's like we kind of skipped the like, oh, we're going to get suitcases of Busch Light. It's like, oh, we're going to get 22s of Total Domination IPA. That's like what we did in college.
You are so spoiled. As the old guy of the team, you're spoiled.
Yeah, we were totally spoiled. And then like places like the Beer Stein, and I was just kind of in love with trying all these new beers and beers from all over the world and all over the US. And then I really fell in love with the craft beer industry. But I had like I said, I had an easy spring term of my senior year, and Oakshire was doing some sort of event at their brewery, and I kind of literally cornered Matt.
Brian's like, intense. He did corner me.
And I was like, hey, I'm getting my chemistry degree. I know you guys don't have a lab. Like, can I come and volunteer and start like a quality control lab for you? I'd already pitched it to my chemistry advisor that they were going to give me credit for it before I had even talked to any brewery. And Matt said no, but his assistant said yes.
Actually, I think to correct you, I think I said, go ask Joe. I don't want to be the parent.
Okay, that's what it was. So then I was there for my last term, kind of just helping.
And you got a free lab at the brewery from a college kid that just wanted to set it up for you?
Totally, yeah.
Oh
why would I say no? That was dumb.
Yeah, and I just like totally fell in love with it. And I was like, I think I was only supposed to be there a couple hours a week, and I was there like every moment I possibly could. And then Matt and I became friends. Matt took me down to Boonville, and then I left Oregon I moved to Michigan. I had why I got my scholarship at school. I got a fellowship through the Department of Defense to do alternative energy research for a lab there. And the whole time I would like fly and meet them at GABF, and I came back for Eugene Beer Week. I went to Savor with them. And I just stayed really close with them. And then when my obligation was up there after 2 years, it was like perfect timing because they were growing and wanted to hire a full-time QA manager. So then I came back and did that. And then that was kind of when I really fell in love with barrel-aged beer. And Matt is like, he left this part out of his bio too, but he's kind of one of the OG barrel-aged brewers in the country.
Well, I followed some really good people. I was at Flossmoor Station, and Todd Ashman was right there with Goose Island making bourbon barrel-aged beers. So right. I learned a lot that way. And Brian was going to allude to this, is I started the barrel aging program at Oakshire and kind of had a real passion for that. And Brian did too, and did a lot of the work there while he was working there.
Yeah, I was working swing shift. So that's when we had space to do all the barrel work. And I just was totally in love with it. And then the more questions I asked about like, well, why are we doing this process? Or what is this specific cellar process? Or how are we taking care of our barrels? The answer I often got from brewers was like, well, I don't know, you just throw it in a barrel and kind of forget about it. And I was not satisfied at all with that answer.
Sure.
So when I left Oakshire, I started working at King Estate next door because I was like, well, wineries have been doing this forever. They definitely know. And that just like, I was only there for like 7 months, and it was just, I learned more in that 7 months than probably, 5 years of brewing, of just like how the cellar works, but then B, just like taking care of oak and managing oak and all those flavor profiles of it. So that was kind of and then at that time, that's when we had always been kind of talking about wanting to start a brewery, Matt and I, and then we just never, it was like, oh, do we do a brew pub in a ski town, or do we whatever. And then it was just kind of like, no, let's focus. We both love barrel aged beer. Let's focus on barrel aged beer. The reason why barrel aged beer isn't a big part of other breweries' programs is because they're too busy making cans of IPA and Pilsner.
Sure.
So let's just like
the beers that people buy.
Right. So it's probably a dumb business move, but let's just like take that out of the equation and just totally focus on barrel aged beer.
And in 2015, when he hit me up with this idea of making 100% barrel aged brewery, I'm like, yeah, it'd be crazy. Like that, we can't make money doing that. No, so I think I told you no probably several times.
Yep. And then my brother, our third business partner, was working for investment firms in Sonoma that was like kind of helping wineries, like really high end wineries that are all focused totally on DTC in their club. And he kind of took what we wanted to do and then was like, okay, well, in wine, this is what they do to make it like, so we got to focus on a club. We got to have this experience. Like, obviously the product has to be really good, but you really got to focus on the experience. So that's what we try to do here. And that was kind of a quick story on how we started Alesong.
Yeah. Sure. And you have absolutely built that very winery-like experience here, from specific tasting experiences that seem to, mirror those kinds of tasting experiences that someone might have at a winery. And I mean, just the location out here, of course, adjacent to a large winery, creating another destination that people can come to out in the country. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, I'm jealous of having 22s of Total Domination in college.
Yeah,
it was like Pete's Wicked Ale and Burt Grant's Scottish Ale, for me back in the day.
Yeah.
But rest in peace. Let's talk about some of those barrel aged beers. But before we do that, looking for innovation in your next beverage breakthrough, think outside the puree box and let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Even smoothie seltzers can benefit from the extra boost of flavor and color. Old Orchard is based in the greater Grand Rapids, Michigan area, also known as Beer City, USA, and supplies craft beverage categories ranging from beer, wine, and cider to seltzer, spirits, and kombucha. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Hey Nano Brewers, Fermentus, the obvious choice for beverage fermentation, is soon offering their dry ale and lager yeasts in flexible 100-gram packaging. To learn more about how Fermentus can improve the quality of your fermentation, and for the latest on their exciting new product releases, visit fermentus.com. So let's talk about this idea. You decide to create a brewery focused on barrel-aged beers. Where do you start? What was this is what, 2015-ish when you're probably kicking the idea around. The beer world looked a little bit different then. There was a lot of optimism certainly still there around, mixed culture beers, about sour beers, and this a lot of budding, hey, we can make these things. I mean, we're still, influenced by Chad Jacobson's brewing 100% Brett beers. And, there was still this like, hey, we can do this, as you guys formulate the idea for Alesong, what was the initial beer approach, and how were you going to go about doing this? What were you going to make, and how are you going to make it relevant to people?
Yeah, I think when we started, we had a plan to, focus on barrel-aged beers. And our mission from day one has been to elevate the way that beer is perceived and experienced. And we want to just take away some of that blue-collar mentality of beer. Not that it's bad. I'll drink a PBR. If you crack one now, I will drink it. But we're doing something different. So we wanted to kind of raise that level.
I agree. It's not that beer has to be one thing or the other. It can be all of these
There's
things.
a beer for every occasion. When I go on the river with my parents back in Iowa, it's a Coors Light, and it tastes good. But when I'm sitting out here in wine country in southwest of Eugene, it's in a stemware, and it's fermented in oak barrels. But we started out wanting to focus on oak, but we knew that just like a winery, it takes a long time to get your product to have some cash flow. And so we started out with mostly barrel-aged beers, but we also made some that were non-barrel-aged beers. We had some Saison, some other Belgian beers, some Abbey beers. We did do some kettle-soured beers that were a little quicker sour, and we used fruit in those. What we wanted to do is have we called it an instant gratification beer. I think Brian came up with that term.
We wanted the club from the beginning, and that was like, we called it a mailing list at that point, but we wanted the club idea from the beginning, and we were like, okay, so there's so many times, because I was a part of several wine clubs, and my brother Doug had been really intimate with that, and Matt is also in wine clubs, and it was just like, if you get the shipment of these awesome cabs, right, you're like, well, I can't drink any of these now and I want to drink some now. And then, so we kind of took that as like, okay, well, that's why it's always awesome to have, in that analogy, you want to have some, like, you know, some white wine or some rosé or something in there that you can drink now. So we're like, all right, let's do, for every release that club release we do, that's 5 or 4 beers, let's have one of them be just like a elevated using whole fruit or a Belgian style that we really like that people aren't really making of. So we did like doubles, quads, and belt wit beers and things. And it was like, okay, that's going to be our instant gratification beer where it's like, cool, this is part of your shipment and you can, you know, it's lower price point, drink these now. And then here's our barrel aged beers. And then we went away from that because everyone was buying more of our barrel aged beers. And I vividly have this memory of doing a tasting in Portland and talking to somebody that had never heard of us. And I was just like, yeah, we focus almost exclusively on barrel aged beers, but I'm sampling you 3 of our non-barrel aged beers today. And I was just like, this light bulb was like, why don't we just focus on this? And we were self-distributing and we're like, we're carrying a case into a market. We should get the price point.
$50 case. And yeah, we decided the last beer we made that was non-barrel aged was a wit beer. We called it Alesong White. And, you know, obviously Allagash White is the in our country, the gold standard. And we wanted
the bronze standard.
That's right. That's right. I was a World Beer Cup too. I did not judge that category, just so you know. And we just thought that'll be.
I did make that same joke to Rob and Jason a few weeks ago.
Nice. Yes. The bronze standard. So we thought that would be great. Well, no one wanted a wit beer from us that was not aged in a barrel, and you know, it just wasn't moving as fast.
Right.
They knew who we were because we set our brand up, how we set it up, and
so then we were just like, you know, these quicker beers are also just so time consuming, and we're not getting the margin on them that we want. And it was just like, let's scratch this. Let's just focus exclusively. We were doing 75% barrel aged beer, and then we're like, let's just go all in. And it's been great so far, and it really enables us to just like hone. I mean, our process is so time consuming and so labor intensive. It's like, it's really hard to do a quick turn ale at the same time as you're trying to juggle all the moving pieces of just one mixed culture fruit beer.
So then what were some of the key pillars of the program then? You know, what were going to, you know, be the major beers then that you're going to hang this program on?
Well, we're still very influenced by the Belgian tradition, and you know, from saisons to lambic beers. We love to drink them. I love the history of that. And so we make kind of 3 threads of beers, sort of what we call our farmhouse beers that are, you know, mostly all Brett fermented. Maybe they're not mixed culture though, as far as lactobacillus. They may have some acidity. And then we have our fruited sour line of beers. They won't always have fruit in them, but most of them are using Oregon grown fruit in them. And then we have our spirits barrel age program, you know, the clean side, and that uses any kind of spirit barrels: bourbon, gin, tequila, rum, and those are our 3 main threads of what we're going for.
Let's talk about how you started creating recipes then to build these. Where did you start?
Well, the first beer we made when we first got started that was going into barrels was Rhino Suit, right?
Stout, yeah.
Yeah, and so and some of that was from sort of my history of brewing big beers to be put in bourbon barrels, because I brewed in Chicago from 2001 to 2009, and as we know, that's where a lot of the origination came from.
Right.
And so I learned a lot from, you know, going to Fobab and some of my friends there making great stouts. And
that's a Festival of Barrel Aged Beers for those that are not familiar with that acronym.
Thank you. And so I just had some recipes that were big, complex stouts, and we knew they're also forgiving when you use that many different malts and put it in bourbon barrels and have that big of a beer.
Forgiving.
Yeah, forgiving in that we were just setting out to figure out what our beers were going to be. And even though I had been a brewer for almost 15 years when we started this, still, I'm on someone else's brew house. We don't own a brew house, and so we would go to our friend's brew house, rent it out, and brew there. So we were still trying to dial in the system, so to speak.
Sure.
And go ahead.
I think, sorry, just to jump in. I think that we kind of took for granted, at least in my perspective, we were like, Matt knows how to make really good bourbon barrel aged beer, and it was just like, okay, we're going to get that out of the way first, and then we're going to focus on how we're going to make really unique wild beers. Because it was like, I remember just being so not stressed out about making bourbon barrel aged beer because Matt had been doing it for so long and does such a good job at it. It was just like, that's down, check mark, done.
Yeah.
And then it was just like, and of course the beers we put out now are by no means the same as that. Like constantly changing things and tweaking things and making them better with every vintage. But it was really like in the beginning, it was focusing on like, okay, how are we going to make these wild beers to like the standard of the beers that we really like to drink? Like, how are we going to make an awesome Brett Saison that we can like hold up next to an Orval, or an awesome mixed culture sour beer that we can hold up to Casey Brewing and Blending or to Chad at Crooked Stave, you know? So it was, I think we were both more intimidated by that side and really trying to hone that in. And that's why it was like bourbon beer first. Yep.
Sure.
Let's get that going.
Yep. Sure. Well, let's talk about that. What makes it forgiving? You know, as you were thinking about a recipe that was going to potentially give you a wider, you know, chance of success, increase that probability with all the variables going on, you know, what did that recipe start looking like? And then let's also talk about how that may, you know, as you build experience on a brew house and have, you know, some track record, how you may have moved that over time to hit exactly, especially even now as tastes continue to change in that whole sphere of barrel-aged beer and what consumers want now. But where did you start?
Right. Well, I think when I talk about forgiving, part of that is if you take so the first recipe was an imperial milk stout, big old imperial stout with lactose. And then the second brew was more of a traditional imperial stout with a little more roasted barley. And we did some blending with those. But when I say forgiving, it's, you know, if that beer had finished at 10% alcohol versus 11%, would it really have mattered? It wouldn't have. So hitting 20 Plato versus 25 versus 26, it's not going to matter. And
right.
so I knew I could figure out how that goes. My philosophy in brewing and creating a recipe is a lot like a chef. I brewing like a chef does in creating recipes, is that you're layering complexities on. You know your ingredients, you know what you're using and how they taste by themselves. And if you've brewed long enough, you kind of know how they work together. And so before Brian makes fun of me for this, I'll just tell you that many of our bourbon barrel aged beers have a lot of different malts in them. We've had what a brewer said to us once, like, oh yeah, we do too, like 6 or 7. Brian's like, oh, Matt uses like 13, 14, 15 different malts. And some people would say, why? But you know what? That has to do with complexity. You know, using pale...
I know another brewer that does it that way too. He's been pretty successful with it. It's Side Project.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Those stouts...
I'm pretty vocal about how he gets a little out of control with not brewing like a professional would, brewing like a home brewer would.
Good. Well, I think it's important to have complexity in those beers because they're so big. They can't be one noted, right? And I learned that from Todd Ashman, who, you know, was at Flossmoor Station and won lots of beer awards in the Midwest. It was one of the first putting beers in bourbon barrels. He ended up opening 50/50 Brewing,
right.
Yep, where Brian and Doug are from in Truckee. So, just kind of learned it from him. And so a lot of different malts, layering complexities, and then using the barrel as a fifth ingredient where that is really how you're layering on multiple flavors. And whether it be coconut, caramel, vanilla, bourbon, all those things come to make a beer like that. So we just set out to make a big beer that had a lot of complexities. And I knew from previous recipes I could make that work for us.
Let's walk through that. I'm curious where these malts are, what they are, and you know how big of that normal, you know, was. I assume it's a 2-row base of a significant portion, and then you know, where do you start building from that base malt?
Yeah, so what I typically like to do is use some of the imported malts like Simpson Golden Promise, Maris Otter 2-row.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting
Can you really taste that flavorful?
I think so, absolutely.
Really? Even through all of that other.
Yep, and we have no problem using some American 2-row, and certainly do in a lot of our beers. But to have that full flavored mouthfeel, like I think the answer is definitely yes, because if you made a beer with all 2-row out of your silo versus dumping bags of Simpson Golden Promise, I think you'd notice the difference. So I think the first start is sort of a real high quality pale ale malt from another country. Now shipping costs are making that tougher and tougher these days, but that's where we start. And then you've got a host of caramel malts. One I really love for some of the beers we make is Double Roasted Crystal from Simpsons also. Just a wonderful malt to eat by itself. Don't even need to brew with it, just munch on it.
Sure.
And then multiple dark malts too. Like for instance, I'll use chocolate malt and pale chocolate just to get more depth of flavor from the chocolate. In those beers, we'll often go a little lighter on roast type things, roasted barley and anything that's going to give it any harshness, just because kind of what we were going for is not the overly sweet beers, but we wanted a sweet roundness to it. And we think sometimes the harshness can be a little too much.
More chocolate, less coffee.
Totally. Yep. But also, I've used some nice brown malt, coffee malt too, that just like layers things in. And then the other thing too is we set out to make that Rhino Suit our first. It's kind of our canvas for painting our adjuncts on. We'll release Rhino Suit by itself. It's an imperial milk stout aged in bourbon barrels. But then we'll add more flavor to it with all the different, we've done mocha, we've done vanilla, we've done raspberry, we've done Senior Rhino, which is our Mexican hot chocolate, our Abraxas sort of tribute. So yeah, I think complexities is where I'm going with this, is more caramel and chocolate and things like that.
How does that play out then? Are you just using small similar percentages across all of these small specialty malts, or are there some that you weigh a little heavier than others?
Well, that's interesting because certainly we'll dabble things in there. However, our batch size, our wort batch size is 20 barrels. That's what we started with because that's what the brewery we were partnering with to go into the brewery and do it with. And we make some 50 barrel batches too. I'm not a fan of having partial bags laying around the brewery that mice can get into, and so I'll just use a whole bag. Sometimes I'll use a half a bag of something, but I like to round up to 55. Now, if we're using something that's a little, stronger, but carafa or roasted barley or anything like that, I'm going to use as much as I need to, 1%, 2%, something, but. And we're putting a whole bag of this, whole bag of that, round up.
Keeping it simple.
And you know what? I mentioned brewing like a chef. I'll really toss a little of this, toss a little of that. And if it doesn't kind of work for you, you just add a little bit more later. It's the only problem is, unlike a chef, our brews aren't instant gratification. I can't taste it 10 minutes later and see if it's okay. We have to wait,
months,
a year, and then go back to the drawing board. So it's a little challenging on that aspect.
Yeah. Now, of course, you're trying to, then mash through this, and then, I imagine you've got a pretty big, grist bill here. Talk to me about that kind of mash process. You're not focusing on the highest possible attenuation, but at the same time, you're also dealing with alcohol that's going to fight against that fermentation itself. What do some of those parameters become through that mash process?
Well, I think the first thing that we have come to realize is when you're brewing something for barrel, it's a little different than brewing a certain style to drink by itself.
Right.
I contend that oak and the booze kind of dries out the palate a little bit, and so I try to make beers that are finish higher than you'd normally want to drink them. And that way, as they age in the barrel, you've got a good balance at the finish. So we'll mash a little higher, a beer I might mash at 152, we'll raise that up to 155 or 156 to leave some more residual sugar behind. Now, all that being said is we make beers that, let's be honest, you could call them pastry stouts these days, but we're not finishing at 15 Plato, 18 Plato, anything like that. Really, where do you try to finish? I mean, 8.5.
Really?
What would you say, between 8 and 10?
Yeah, and it's funny. I've been holding this back this whole time because when we first started and we were just like, we got to finish at 9 to go in a barrel, we'd get eye rolls from brewers being like, that's so high. What are you thinking? It's too high. And now it's
changed.
Now we're the ones that are like putting way too dry of a beer in a barrel. It's like people are putting 20 Plato beer in barrels and stuff now. But we I would just like to say that we focus really heavily on balance, and we want you to have multiple glasses of something. And I think that if you have a beer that's, 20 bricks left, it's like pretty hard to have multiple glasses of it, in my opinion, than something that has, eight bricks left.
No, that's not an opinion, Brian. That's actually a fact. You are right. When we're talking in Plato here, home brewers that are listening might be talking specific gravity, but when you have a finished beer that is the same viscosity as most beers starting wort, or way more than most beers starting wort, that doesn't work for me. It just doesn't work for me. And there's some delicious beers out there that have a high finishing gravity, but we're in the business of drinking glassfuls for enjoyment. We would love for people to share our beer, but we'd rather you just drink the whole thing yourself and ask for another. That's just how our philosophy has been. And I feel like an 8 Plato finishing beer is way more drinkable than a 20 Plato finishing beer.
Sure. Sure. Since you are barrel aging and then building all of these generally out of blends, and you're brewing a whole bunch of beer, do you vary base recipes in order to build bigger blending stock, or do you brew a pretty consistent recipe then that just lets the different barrel expressions add their own character to it?
We've kind of done both, but we do, having the high inventory of barrel stock is huge for us. I think one of the things that we have an advantage in being a brewery that brews all barrel-aged beer is we have a huge cellar full of barrels. And some breweries, if they just have a small barrel program of 8 barrels, 16 barrels, 24 barrels, whatever, you have to just brew the beer, and whatever comes out, you say, well, this is it. I hope you like it. There's nothing to blend it in, and unless you maybe brew a non-barrel aged beer and tweak it a little bit. But we've got all kinds of barrels, and we have, what did we do recently, or a year ago, I guess it was, time flies. We had like a chocolate stout. Then we brew like 3 different beers at once just for that.
Yeah, we do both. So like our Imperial Milk Stout is like kind of our workhorse in that series, and it's Rhino Suit and turns into a lot of other things. And then we have, we'll have that in several different types of barrels to have, again, complexity in the blend, or to be able to choose if we wanted to do single barrel variants or something. And then also, we did a chocolate porter, and then we also just did a big Imperial Stout without the lactose in it and something more bitter. And then we've done this on our more pale barrel aged beers too. So the barley wine, and then we have like some other blenders that we can use for cocktail beers and stuff. So it's really like, I think a big turning point for the quality of our beers was when we finally got to that threshold of like, we've got enough beer in barrels that we're not like, this batch went into these barrels and it has to get released. It's like, oh, we have more beer in barrels than we're going to release this year. And that was like a big turning point for us to put out way better beer, because we just had like more colors in our palette that we could go not only of different base styles, but different types of wood and different types of spirit as well.
And I think that was a goal from the start. Even though we had a pretty small barrel program, we called ourselves Alesong Brewing and Blending, because we knew from day one we were going to be blending different barrels together, and that was going to be a big piece of the complexities of the beer that we were producing.
Do you, is everything pretty consistent in terms of gravity around that? I know there are certainly blending strategies now where certain brewers are brewing higher gravity beers they're putting into barrels, knowing that they're never going to release that'll become a blending component, because they tend to age with those spirits barrels in different ways. Does that ever enter into your program, or are you just keeping it on the drier side?
Yeah, drier side compared to modern brewing for sure. But I'd say that our finishing gravity in our cellar on that side is probably from 7 to 13 or 14, maybe 13 on the high end.
So it is a decently, reasonably wide range.
Yeah. And again, we're vintage brewers. It's like, just because we're making Rhino Suit every year, that Rhino Suit recipe is tweaked every year as well. So it's like we're not trying to do the same exact bourbon barrels, the same exact length of time, the same flavor profile exactly. It's really like, that's what was so romantic with me about wine vintages, is like, then that's how we approach all of our beers. So it could be called Rhino Suit, but it's Rhino Suit 21 as opposed to Rhino Suit 2020. And it's going to be different because we tweak the recipe because palates change and palates adjust, and we got different barrels and the temperature in the cellar was different. So it's like having all of that flexibility. And it's really like, when you're getting one of our beers, it's our palate that we went through and tasted, and we're like, oh, in this season, this is the one that we liked. So that's what we blended together.
Sure. Over time, are there some things that you, from 2016 to now, some things that have worked their way out of the recipe and some things that have worked their way into it?
I don't know if on the spirits barrel age side, we have anything I can think of that has kind of gone by the wayside. We are experimenting more with starting and finishing gravities, but I think on the wild mixed culture side, I think we definitely have changed some things, not only from wort production to some of our blending and processing techniques as well to make better beer.
We'll talk about that soon, but not yet. Don't spoil that. We got to leave that hanging out there.
The only thing I can think of on the spirits barrel age size is we spent the first several seasons honing in what type of bourbon barrel we liked that was just like the one that we liked the most and was most repeatable and got good character. And it's Heaven Hill is the one that we came back to every time. So we first were like, we're going to get a smattering of barrels and put the same base in it and see where we like it and what comes across. And it's like, you'd buy these really expensive, really old, 24-year bourbon barrels, whatever. And then you're like, wait a minute, the 8-year Heaven Hill that's most likely Evan Williams, like, comes across better in this beer than these, Woodford 20-year Woodfords or whatever.
Sure,
And
sure.
that's kind of the only thing I can think of that we've really just like honed in on. The bulk of our cellar is Heaven Hill barrels, and then we have a smattering of other barrels to play with, but that's kind of the bulk of it. I think that's probably the only thing that we really changed on that side.
Small little pro tip here. Pappy Van Winkle 23 year is a great bourbon. But I don't know if it makes the best beers because all the flavor has been extracted out of those barrels into that yummy bourbon. And so get a little younger barrels and you'll get more oak and whiskey flavor.
Isn't that like every brewer's secret? Yeah. That Pappy 23 barrel beer that you so highly coveted actually has a few other barrels blended in, and those are the ones that are probably adding some more of the flavor than the Pappy. Well, I mean, but hey, the marketing and the name works.
The marketing is what'll sell that beer for you.
Absolutely, I would still use one of those barrels.
Me too.
In a blend.
I would still buy it. I would still buy it if I had the chance.
Sure. How's fermentation look on that? I imagine it's a clean, you just Cali ale yeast fermentation and keeping that pretty clean.
Yep. Cal Ale yeast is our workhorse for our bourbon barrel aged beers, spirits barrel aged beers. What do you say, 68 or?
Yeah, we're at 68 on that, and it's pretty quick. Goes till dry, give it a rest, and then it goes. We'll cool it to crash out most of the yeast, and then it goes down into barrel. So pretty, straightforward.
Pretty easy.
Yeah.
And you do, I should say, keep the clean and the funky side of the brand separate in separate buildings. Is that just a space issue, or is that due to some concern about cross-contamination?
I'd say more of a space issue. When we first started, we had them both in the same cellar, and we didn't have any issues. The only time we've had infection issues is when they were in separate facilities. But that was the insane heat wave that made our cellar incredibly hot, and that kind of torched some barrels for us. But it's really size. It is convenient having them separate, and so that means just by nature we have separate pumps and separate tools and stuff.
Sure.
But we're still using the same bottling line and the same blending tanks, and we've done that from the get-go. So we're pretty anal in the cellar on our cleaning and sterilization processes to make sure that we can use the same tanks and bottling line for these beers.
Sure. And since you don't have a brew house per se, you can invest in other pieces of this to make it all work for you. Let's talk about adding ingredients into those barrel aged stouts. But before we do, the secret is out, and Canada Malting Company's newest malt is here, introducing Europils made from the finest overseas low protein barley available. This malt exudes traditional European Pilsner malt character, highlighted by the biscuity notes, which accent the subtle grassy undertones. Europils is available now in limited quantities in select markets, so don't miss out. Contact Country Malt Group to try Europils in your next brew. Also, as craft beer's most trusted point-of-sale system, Arrived is the mobile all-in-one solution you need to decrease service friction and increase guest satisfaction. With a full suite of craft-specific features, no contracts, and no monthly fees, Arrived provides the necessary tools to help your brewery grow. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. Remember, there is no I in Arrived. On that cross-contamination question, I was meeting up with Trevor and Matt at DeGard last night, and I loved it because they are fermenting their wine in the same tanks that have previously fermented, sour, spontaneous beer. And it would take quite a cleaning regimen for me to trust that kind of move. But it's kind of amazing what you can accomplish if you just clean things well.
Yeah. What is the timing it takes you to turn over a tank, Brian?
Yeah, I guess I'll just, so when we're about to put a clean beer, so say we're switching our bright tank from a bottling a mixed culture beer to a clean beer, it gets a PBW cycle, so just like the powdered brewery cleaner cycle, and then it gets a full caustic cycle, and then it gets steamed, so the whole tank gets up to 180 degrees. All the parts get boiled, and any like sight glasses, they just get swapped out for new, and then cools down, goes through a Sani. So that, it takes probably most of a day to turn our 100 barrel blending tank into from wild beer to clean beer. And that's kind of the regimen for everything. It's just like, it's PBW, caustic, steam, chemical Sani.
Sure. It's quite a process.
Yeah.
Yeah. How often do you do that?
So yeah, it's just between when we're switching. So like things in production, it generally tends to like, okay, we're going to do a bunch of wild beer at once because it's whether filling barrels because fruit season just happened, or we just packaged a bunch of wild beer, and then, or it's like we're going into winter and we're going to be barreling down a bunch of bourbon beer. So it kind of comes in waves.
Sure.
Of like, it's pretty rare that you're like, oh, we're going to do wild beer this week, clean beer next week, wild beer the next week. So
right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about adding ingredients. Clearly that's a big part of everyone's barrel-aged stout program these days. How do you all approach that? And you've already mentioned you try to brew like a chef. And here's your chance to use culinary ingredients in beers. Where do you start with that? What's your evaluation process look like? And how do you start building, that kind of adjunct ingredient, part of the beer? How do you think about that and start building it so that all those flavors work together?
One thing that's interesting is we don't do a lot of test batching, pilot batching. We will do some little bench trials now and again if we got a new ingredient. We're trying to see how much impact it has on picking up flavor extraction. But at least in the early days, we just kind of went for it. We're like, I think a pound per barrel or something.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is like we come up with the base blend, and then we sit around and we taste it, and we go, okay, either A, this is awesome, let's release it. Doesn't need anything. Or it's like, oh, this would be really awesome if it had a little more umami, or it had a little more chocolate, or it was a little more heavy mouthfeel, or this or that. And then that's kind of where you build on it. And you're like, oh, I'm getting this really cool vanilla note from this bourbon barrel. It'd be nice to up that a little bit. So it's really just like tasting the base and then talking about like, oh, what would make this better? And it's never done in one shot.
So you work from then that base beer. I know I've asked folks that before. Like, do you have an idea for a beer and choose the barrels to fit that, or do you taste barrels and then start building around that?
Yeah, it's both. Yeah. I mean, I think for us, because we're exclusively doing these, it's not just like, oh, we have these barrels in the back and when they're ready, they're ready. Like we don't have that luxury. And I think that's mostly marketing anyways when people say that. But it's like we have a production plan. We're planning 2 years out on what we want to do and what we want to make. And then as we get closer, that's when you're tasting it. And the production plan often changes.
Some people say they listen to the barrels and serve it when it's ready. We tell the barrel when it's ready. Okay.
Well, I mean, again, that's a beauty of having so many barrels in your cellar is you can come up with an awesome blend kind of if you have to. But the biggest thing is like, if we have on the schedule, like, okay, adjunct Rhino Suit is on the schedule, or we'll even have it down to like, okay, we're going to do Mocha Rhino Suit again. Well, we can get to that point and we can taste it and we'll be like, actually, this already has some like cool cinnamon flavors. Let's scrap that. And we're going to do Senior Rhino instead. Right. Or we're like, just going to release Rhino Suit this time. And then we taste Rhino Suit and we're like, man, it's a little thinner this year than previous years. Let's up that. Let's add chocolate and vanilla beans to it so we can like up some body and mouthfeel. And it's really like, we brew it with the idea in mind, and then we taste the blend and we're like, okay, how do we make this the best possible beer we can? And that often changes. And Huck, my lead seller, if he was out here, he'd be rolling his eyes because there's so many times that we just delay packaging because we're like, oh, it's not ready yet. Nope, we need to tweak it. Nope, it's not ready yet. We're going to add this thing into it. Nope, not ready yet. So it's really like we take that last step so seriously and so time consuming, and it takes up so much of our effort because it's like we're just tweaking it until it's in the bottle, and then frankly if I could still tweak it when it was in the bottle I would. But it's just that's the
what is that ingredient addition process? Well, and let's start with ingredient sourcing. Is there any magic to that for you, or a way that you taste and evaluate those ingredients?
Yeah, definitely. In Oregon and many places in the country, we have such good access to things, even if they're not grown in our country. So coffee roasters, for one. We put coffee in something, and we have a plethora of awesome
what do we have,
roasters.
Like 8 or 9 coffee
in
roasters
in
this town.
Yeah, town of 170,000 people. Right. So we can pick and choose the coffee that we like. And also some of them will work with us. Actually, the ones we've worked with will work special roasts for us and kind of custom blend something, which is really nice.
When you say custom roast, what do you find? Is there a specific kind of roast that you tend to prefer for coffee that you're pushing into your beer?
So what's tricky is that when you work with any artisan, right, they want to show off what they can do. And when we talk to roasters, they're like, okay, so do you want like a blueberry profile in this, or do you want this? And then oftentimes I'm like, look, if I wanted to add blueberries to this beer, I'd add blueberries to this beer. Like we want coffee flavored coffee, right? And that's like, so that's one of those things is you're like, okay, how can we get like a really cool coffee expression that when you taste it, you're like, ooh, that's awesome coffee, but it doesn't have the like bitterness and the acidity from that either. So we've kind of settled on coffee plant roasters are here with West Eugene. Their espresso roast is really good for that, and we're still like tweaking with things on that. But it's really like on the stout side of things, it's really like, okay, we want a vanilla bean to make it taste like vanilla. We want a cocoa nib to make it cocoa nibs too. Chocolate Alchemy here in Eugene, they're rad, and they supply cocoa nibs for so many people across the country, and they have so many different just like sources of nibs, and then the way they roast them and all these things. And you go in there and you're just like learning so much every time you go in there about different nibs, and then at the end of the day, you're like, I love what you're doing, and I love all these cool nuanced flavors you can get, but they just get lost in the beer. We need this to just be like impactful chocolate.
Give me a brownie flavor in your chocolate. I mean, the guy, he's great. I love John, and he impresses us. He built a winnowing machine that takes the husk off a cocoa nib and sold one to Stone. I guess they use it in something. And then also he worked with Big Bad Baptist Brewers.
Epic.
Thank you. Yeah. Epic Brewing, because they make a lot of that stuff too. And so he's worked with breweries around the country, and we can just drive to his place and get it. But like Brian said, we just want it to taste like chocolate, and we want it to taste like coffee. But we can source all kinds of herbs from Mountain Rose Herb here in town. And so like whatever we want to get, we have outlets for them here. We don't have to get on Amazon or whatever. And they can source really good, high quality things. They might be organic, they may not, but we know they're going to taste great in our beer.
What's that creative process look like then when you're thinking about something? Do you order a bunch of, or go over and grab a bunch of stuff and, start tasting and rubbing and smelling? Or do you work from inspiration from something that you've had from a local chef? I mean, where do you start pulling those things from?
I think it's both of those things. I think a lot of times we draw inspiration from other beers we've had, from foods that we've eaten. And it might just be we went down there. The Mountain Rose Herb Mercantile, where it's just kind of their small shop where you don't buy in bulk. You can just get these little 4-ounce packets of things, and so we'll bring that back to the brewery and taste and smell. And there's several kinds of cinnamon you can use in beers. And should we use this one from Sri Lanka or not? And so we'll bring those in, and we can easily steep some stuff out of a barrel. And I did say we don't trial that much, but we actually do to figure out exactly what we want.
And I think that I'd say the bulk of our inspiration comes from food. It's like the amount of times probably in Matt, Doug, and I's group text message that it's like a photo of something, and we're like, this would be an awesome beer, or like, let's try this. And like our inspiration for beers all the time, always like either a cocktail, some sort of cool food thing we had, or again, inspiration from just a cool ingredient that we can get locally. But a lot of it is like, oh yeah, wouldn't this be cool if we did this? And then it's like, okay, let's wrap our heads around how that works. Yeah.
What's the addition process look like? Are you all recirculating, bagging, free floating, or using some combination of techniques for these?
Well, I'll let Brian kind of explain, but I think the biggest improvement we made is when we got some bigger tanks, and now we can do this steeping process where it's moving the beer back and forth on our stuff until it's the right flavor. But Brian, if you want to walk through
we
that.
always start, and again, going back to drinkability, to quote the big guys, we really try to have these beers drinkable and drinking lots of ounces of them, and like we use less percentage of adjuncts than a lot of our peers do. And we probably always start on the lower end, and then we add until we like it. So it's like so on the bigger batches, it's like we'll have our 100-barrel blend tank, and then we have our 20-barrel bright tank, and we've our fabricator here in town has made me a false bottom in it. So we have it in bags and on the false bottom. And we'll just like recirc back, and it'll like go on, sit overnight, and then recirc, and then go on, sit overnight, and recirc. And we kind of keep doing that process until we get the extraction that we want. There's definitely times where we're like, shoot, we've kind of extracted all the nib flavor we want, and it's not enough. So then we'll do it. We'll like have to restart and keep going.
Sure.
But we were like pretty careful not to go over, at least for our palates of what we prefer, to go overboard on that. And then even on a small scale, we have some smaller like 8-barrel tanks that are set up the same way that we can, if we're doing a 20-barrel batch, we can kind of recirc in those 8-barrel tanks. Like right now we're adding vanilla to a beer, and that's just in bags in a fermenter. And when, and I'm just stirring it through the carb stone. And when it gets to the expression we like, we'll transfer it into the bright tank, and it'll be done. But always having a tank in the cellar available to be like, okay, it's done, get it off. Because I think in any of those adjuncts, you can start getting off flavors the longer it's on there.
So that's more of like a high concentration than maceration or extraction that you're then pumping back into the main tank.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Are there any ingredients that have posed you particular challenges, or ones that you find that you need to continue to add or push past what you thought, or ones where you found that just you needed to source a different ingredient or a different location or origin for that in order to get the expression that you were truly looking for?
Yeah, for sure. And I think more so on the fruit side for our mixed culture beers, but on the bourbon side, like what's really interesting is when you have a blend of adjuncts in a beer to see like which ones fade as it's in the bottle and which ones come out more in the bottle. It's like cinnamon seems to like come out the longer it's in a bottle, whereas like coconut really fades in the bottle. It's like after 6 months, it just tastes way less coconutty than when you first went into it. So that's kind of just a learning process on like, oh, if we do the cinnamon to what we want it to taste in the bright tank, it's going to be too much cinnamon. So in 6 months. So it's like finding that balance of like, okay, do we want to cater to the people that are holding on to our beer for 6 months, which is fine. I'd rather, you should drink it sooner, and buy more. but the kind of finding that balance of like how it ages in the bottle is probably the biggest thing on the bourbon barrel age side.
What's the goal then? Every brewer is shooting for it. And if you're an IPA brewer, you're shooting for 90 days of,
right.
That first 90 days, and it needs to be good up until then. And then after you hit that date code, that's it.
That's one of the challenges that we find in a brewery like ours is that we're like, when are you going to drink it? And we have so many people who ask us, hey, how long is this good for? And our first response is, we aged it for you. It's ready. We release when it's ready. You should drink it now. However, it will age gracefully in the proper temperatures, and so you can keep it. I often joke you should buy 12 bottles and just try it once a month, and you'll see what it's like after a year. But They don't always take me up on that. So I don't know. I think we try to find a balance maybe of tasting awesome now and aging gracefully, but we do know there's going to be some changes, and I don't know that there's anything we can do about that. I think the biggest thing we can do is make sure it's a clean beer that is going to age gracefully and no other problems with it, no off flavors to start, no off flavors later.
And most importantly is when we release it, because that's when we have it in draft in the tasting rooms. That's when the bulk of our club members are drinking it. So it's like really doing that. And then I think it's for our own curiosity and our own like improvement for the next year to be like, okay, we could probably dial back the cinnamon a little on that one, or we should dial up the coconut on that one. Like it's small tweaks, but it's really probably like we want it to be great when it's released.
Sure. We've talked a lot about barrel-aged clean beers, but we've only hinted about Brett beers and mixed culture beers. So let's flip it here and start talking about that. One of the early beers you brewed, Touch of Brett, landed a very early gold medal at GABF for you. You've since picked up quite a bit of hardware in Brett beers. Let's talk about building Brett beer and how you started formulating not just an idea for this, but recipe and technique to execute on it.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons we started out with a 100% Brettanomyces fermented beer. And Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we knew that we could produce a beer like that in a little quicker time than a long-aged mixed culture sour beer. And so that was one of those early, we need some cash flow coming, so it wouldn't take 12 months in a barrel to finish. And two, we're very influenced, as I mentioned before, by the Belgian tradition. And a beer that we both love is Orval, and love how it evolves from a bitter beer to start. And when the Brett expression comes up as the hop character goes down, we wanted to explore that sort of thing. And so we made sort of a rustic farmhouse base, and we used Brettanomyces. Did we have a blend from the start, or was it a single strain?
No, the first one was Clausenii.
Yeah,
for that first one.
Yep, and we didn't really know what we needed. We knew we liked that strain, so we started there. That was probably batch 3 to go into a fermenter for us. And what we wanted to do was also have a very healthy ferment. We know Brett beers can be stressed out when you put in the Brett post fermentation. If you use sack first, we wanted it to have a healthy expression. And we find that many of our Brett beers have a very fruity, tropical pineapple notes, and not as much maybe as the horsey, funky, sweaty sort of character. Although you get those after aging. And we wanted to use some, New World hops that would complement the Brett yeast character well. And so we just set out to start with that. It was called Touch of Brett, inspired by Touch of Grey from Grateful Dead. We have some song references in the Alesong repertoire. And we entered it in GABF, and lo and behold, it won the gold medal at GABF. That first year, we were 5 months old.
Yeah.
from selling our
that was
first
pretty
beer,
crazy.
and we won a gold. And
I made a bit of a scene in the audience of that one.
he did. I think he just about lost it. And I try to subscribe to the the saying, act like you've been there before after scoring a touchdown. But
I think that's what Matt hit. I think he hit me and was like, act like you've been here before. And I was like, I haven't, Matt. You have.
That's true. I had been there before, so I knew the feeling, but I think I still probably lost it too, because this was my company. I've worked for several other people, great people in the brewing industry.
Sure.
But now this was mine, and it was my and Brian and Doug's gold medal and Alesong's gold medal. So that was pretty special to win with that beer. And so therefore we had to continue to make that beer and beers like that, because we set the bar high for ourselves.
So when you say a friendly fermentation or a gentle fermentation and a low stress Brettanomyces fermentation, what are some of the factors that weigh into that?
So higher pitch rates. So we pitch that at like lager pitch rates. We also ferment it cooler, so we'll let it free rise to
You're counting your cells and making sure yourself, or
so these are we're
pitch?
getting laboratory pitches.
Cool.
And then we let it rise to like 73, and then we ferment it down at 68. Fermenting at that temp seems to really drive citrus character for us. The other big thing
is still Classenae.
In all of our Bretts,
okay,
all the Brett strains. I think that it's really interesting to be like, okay, the iconic like off flavors of Brett in a Brett infection is like when you have a wine that's infected by Brett, because that's about as harsh of an environment as it can get, and it kicks off like the most probably unpleasant Brett aromas and flavors. But if you're like inoculating it where it's the only strain in there, you're giving it tons of oxygen. We oxygenate for 3 days after brewing. 3
days?
Yeah, so we'll do like a normal oxygenation into the tank, and then we do about 10 minutes of oxygen for the next 2 days, so 3 total.
Pure oxygen?
Yep. And then it's really just like, it's the only thing in there. It usually takes 4 days to kick off, and then when it starts going, it's a slow ferment, but we just let it go, and it probably goes to about 85% attenuation in that first go, and then it goes the rest of the way in the barrel. But it's really just like having a good nutrient source in the grain bill. We use a ton of raw grains, and you got to make sure that because that beer is going to go to zero Plato, so you got to make sure that there's still some body and mouthfeel left. So there's a lot of raw grains in there to kind of help A, with nutrients of the Brett, but B, with the mouthfeel on the finished beer.
What does that grist bill look like then?
Well, a lot of it is unmalted wheat. So we use malted wheat, and so 2-row, unmalted wheat, malted wheat. We use some oats to bring some more mouthfeel to that, and there's also rye in it. So it's sort of a. I hesitate.
You do like making complex malt.
I know. Well, I
here.
hesitate to call it a rye saison, because I think it's only, I don't know the percentage, but it's a bag of rye. And then wheat, oats, and rye, along with the 2-row.
Mm-hmm. How much, in rough percentages, obviously, since we don't have the entire recipe right here, how much would be, base malt versus,
those adjuncted malts.
Right.
I think if I were to guess, about 70% 2-row, maybe 10% oats. I'm sorry, that's probably 20% wheat, and then 10% oats and a percent of rye, 2% rye, something like that. That didn't equal 100, but
who's counting?
Yeah. Also, I can't give away all the secrets. Actually,
Sure
I can, because guess what? No one buys Brett Saison. We can tell you all about how to make this. You're not going to make it because you can't sell it.
I buy Brett Saison.
I drink a lot of Brett Saison.
Hey. God bless you. And thank you for making it, because it's enjoyable for me to drink too. So you go through this, fermentation. How long is that, general primary before you, get it to that 85-ish percent?
Yeah, it's usually 6
weeks.
6 weeks. 6 weeks in stainless. And then, down into barrel.
And then how long do you let it finish in barrels before it gets to where you want it to be?
Yeah, so one of the ways that easiest to tell if a beer is done in barrel or not is if it's clear. But generally on just total Brett Saison, it's probably another 4 months in barrel before I'd if we wanted to do an early touch of Brett. Touch of Brett's awesome because it still has some of the hop bitterness, and then we dry hop it freshly, but it's still a relatively young beer. I mean, it's probably 4, maybe 5 months in barrel, and then it's another 6 weeks in bottle conditioning after it's been obviously 6 weeks in primary before that. So it's a pretty young beer for us, and you can taste it. It's fresher. It's a little brighter than our longer aged beers. But that base is also really good to go on a fruit. to cut down our blonde sour base. So we have kind of the Brett Saison and then the blonde sour that are kind of the key building blocks of our sour program. So we'll keep a lot of that around in barrel to cut down acidity on fruit blends and things too.
With that, because you've clearly, well, let me back up on that. Let me say, what does the barrel component add to a beer like Touch of Brett then? It's a shorter amount of time, a few months. You've already got most of the fermentation finished in stainless. Why then pull that into, go through this additional complex process of adding to barrel, letting it sit in a barrel for that much longer?
Yeah, so that last 15% of attenuation is the most important. I mean, when you're tasting it out of stainless at that point, it's really edgy, it's bitter. There's still a ton of yeast in solution and stuff, but it's just like, it's edgy, it's not round, it doesn't complete your palate. And then going into oak, we're using all neutral French oak, and neutral oak to us it's been probably 4 or 5 vintages at a winery before we've gotten to it. So very neutral. And so we're not getting a ton of oak character either, but what you're getting with these neutral oak wine barrels is it's just like a vessel for it to mature in, a small vessel for it to mature in. And it's rounding out those flavors. It's rounding out the complex proteins that are happening in there. And it's giving the yeast its final push to go to dryness. And it's just like really finishes out the beer with some slight oxidation in there too.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you said. It's a maturation tank, and we already had it in primary for 6 weeks, and we can't just put it in a bright tank for however many months you said. So it's just a way to move it out to make the next beer, and it has some benefits being a smaller vessel.
And since you have a winery right next door to you that is pushing out barrels all the time, I guess you have an access to some less expensive maturation vessels then.
That's right.
Yeah, and I don't want to say I don't think the beer, I mean, maybe that's an experiment we should do, is we should rack some into kegs so it's like just in stainless the whole time versus being in oak, because we're not picking up oak character, but you are really getting some unique characteristics of just, because it is barrel to barrel variance, even when you're using first use for us barrels. And it's really just that oxidation piece that rounds everything out and gives you just this nice perceived full body on a, completely dry beer.
You were mentioning as we were touring the brewery before we started the podcast that when it's time to grab more barrels, that you like to go over and choose barrels.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about some of that process and what you look for as you are evaluating barrels. You've got a whole bunch of stuff, and a lot of them have done, made similar or the same wine for that matter, but some barrels speak to you more than others. What is some of that criteria as you're evaluating these, that where you can smell or see specific things that lead you to be more or less attracted to a specific barrel?
Yeah, there's a couple pretty very obvious things, and it's first is VA, and I think anybody that's ordered barrels from or I should say wine barrels specifically from a broker, is it sucks when you get them in and you're just like, oh, there's a bunch of VA in that, which is like acetone or volatile acidic compounds. So that's the first thing that you're smelling for, and then if that's not there, and then you're looking at the barrel, and luckily the contents inside were red, and oak is not red, so you can see if there's any leaks. So those are the two very basic things that you look for. And then when you're going into it as well, I look to see what wine was in it, and because I worked at King Estate, I know which blocks I like, and I know which vineyards we like. So you're like, okay, these are this is a much more full-bodied Pinot than these ones, or the year of the barrel too. I'd rather get one that's younger than one that's older, so we can at least get a little more oak character out of it. But it's really going in and smelling them, and you'll just be like, this one is so neutral, it just smells like wet wood, where this one still smells beautifully of Pinot Noir and oak, or kind of going through. It's really just a, I don't know, gut, I guess.
Sure. So you put it through this process, and now you've got Touch of Brett that you can release by itself, but nobody really drinks.
I mean, we shouldn't say that, because our club members really enjoy it.
Good.
It's a great beer for our club members.
You've built an educated clientele that can appreciate what you do,
and we're converting people constantly when they come into our tasting room, and they're like, "Well, I'll have your IPA," and then they're shocked that we don't make IPA. So then we give them a Touch of Brett, and they're like, well, this is an IPA, but it's pretty good. And then, that's how we convert them. That's our gateway beer.
Sure.
And I'll just tease out our next beer release is going to have a beer that we're calling a Juicy Farmhouse Ale.
Ooh.
Not a Brett IPA, Juicy Farmhouse Ale. And it's nice and juicy.
It's fun. Yeah, we had an opportunity to use some like more modern hops. It's so because we don't make IPA, Matt and I are just so out of the IPA game and the modern hop game. So once a year we make an IPA for our anniversary that we do a collaboration with a brewery in the Northwest
And have it canned.
So it's just like kind of total opposite for us. But it's a really good opportunity to like kind of get back in the hop game and see all the new products and all that stuff.
And so we've been able to use some of those things in this new Brett Saison that we've got coming out. And we labored over what we should call it, because I don't know.
Yeah, we're going to get some eye rolls on that Juicy Farmhouse, but you know.
We figured today's drinker knows that juicy means they added more hops. All right. And some juice forward flavored hops.
Yeah, and it's not bitter.
Yeah.
So after this process, you pull it out of the individual barrels, and now you either bottle or then some of that becomes beer that you add fruit to. What's that fruit process then look like for you?
Yeah, so we're very, very seasonal and very harvest oriented, and we really strive to source fruit from as close to home as possible. And I work with several small growers that like some of which we're buying their entire crops, and they're picking based on when we want them to pick them. Fortunately, though, King Estate, again, next door, not only do they grow world-class grapes and Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, but they have awesome blueberries and raspberries and pears and apples and other things I'm forgetting. But we've gotten a bunch of good fruit from them that they'll, again, pick kind of to our parameters. We also work with other just small orchards around us. I mean, we're just spoiled in the valley that we're in. Sure, that we have a bunch of cool fruit. I think that, would I be preaching about local agriculture so much if I lived in Colorado? Probably there's some good places in Colorado, but it's not as easy as it is for us, right?
It's harder for Troy Casey to pull this off.
It is harder for sure.
He works hard to make it work.
And he makes it work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So a lot of that is like, we'll go through, and honestly, to pick the base beer that's going to go into fruit it's like, you kind of want a beer that's boring. You want a beer that's like not too acidic, that doesn't have too much Brett character, that's not like super oaky. It's like, really in reality kind of a flabby, boring beer, because you want the fruit to shine. And like, we're using whole fruit picked.
Flabby, boring beer.
Yeah,
so you also want some of that a less edge, a little more residual sweetness potentially.
Well, they're all bone dry, but when I say flabby, it's probably more it's just more perceived, like just it's not just like dry on your palate. It's leaving, whether that's tannin structure or it's just like some leftover from the wheat or whatever is in the base malt or base beer. Because you really want the fruit to shine, and we also want the microbes that are on the fruit to come through and express themselves as a version of terroir. Because we want each of our fruit beers, like even though we do a handful of the same fruit beer every year, they're very different because it's a different crop and it's a different, time of year that was picked and different. So not only is the fruit different, but the bugs that are on the fruit are different, and that's going to create a different process. And we don't want like a base beer that's going to overpower that sense of terroir or that sense of, or the fruit that is going on top of it. So the base, so like our lambic inspired blonde sour base, which Matt will talk to you about the hot side, but that is like our workhorse on this. And then we blend it. If that gets a little too acidic because it's hot in the cellar or whatever, we'll blend in some Brett Saison to temper that acidity and again, probably make it a little more boring of a beer before we add some really delicious fruit to it. And the fruit again is picked. The only time it's frozen. So we get frozen fruit from King Estate next door, the raspberries, because they don't get enough volume in at a time. So they'll pick them and I'm so spoiled working with farmers directly, because we've all gotten ordered fruit from wholesalers or whatever, and you get it in and only like 25% of it's ripe. But they have a big freezer and they're willing to do this for me. So they pick the raspberries as they're ripe and put them in the freezer. And then when they have the 600-800 pounds that I need, they'll call me and then I'll get them. But otherwise it's like, we're getting fruit picked. We're picking it up that same day or the next day, and then it's going into our beer. So it's really fresh. And then again, at its peak ripeness too. So it's almost like couldn't stay on the vine for much longer, but then it's fermented on the whole on the skins, and then kind of at that point we treat it like wine. It's fermented on the skins until dry again. So usually pick up a couple of bricks from the fruit edition, ferments until dry, and then it comes off the skins back into barrel to finish maturing. And that last maturation is again just rounding out. It's letting some of those natural bugs express themselves and round out the acids and all that, and then blended. And then that last blending is where we can again adjust if we need to on acidity or temper it down or whatever we want to do.
Back into wood after the fruiting process.
Yep. So we fruit generally in either one of our large format oak vessels or in a stainless steel fruiting tank. And then, it's only on the skins for probably 3 weeks max. And then it gets racked off the fruit back into oak to finish maturing.
And that's a little extra process that a lot of brewers do not engage in after that. I mean, even lambic producers generally will not do that.
Totally.
It'll go through that fruit process and it goes straight out of there into bottling.
Yep.
You alluded to it for a second there, but I think we kind of got lost in the mix. What does that additional step truly add to the overall je ne sais quoi of the beer?
Yeah, I think it's really just sharpness. I mean, when you get it right off the fruit, to me, at least in our cellar and our bugs, right? I'm not digging on anybody that does it, but it's just like for us and for our palate, like right when the fruit fermentation's done, and if you let it go a little longer too, it's just like kind of one-dimensional. You're very, very fruit forward, and it's just kind of a peak of sharp fruit flavor with some of that mixed culture acidity that's coming from the fruit. But it's not enough time to develop and really round that out on your palate and give you the opportunity as well to see like, okay, where is this going to go? So you take it off the skins and you're in barrel and you're like, all right, how is this going to evolve in the bottle as well? And then you can do that final blend, that final touch up to be like, cool, this is exactly where we want it. And that's where it's going to kind of stay.
And I shouldn't say that no lambic producers drink, because some are, and there's a wide variety on that. But nonetheless, it's interesting that you all focus on doing it that way. Let's talk about that sour blonde beer that you also, that becomes another one of the pillars of these, in addition to that Brett. That one's a lambic inspired beer with a turbid, at least turbid-ish mash. Talk to me about that, Matt.
Yeah, so we like you said, turbid, pseudo turbid mash is what we call it, and so it's kind of got a lambic.
Because you're still brewing this at somebody else's brew house, and they're gonna have to use the equipment that they have for you to brew.
Totally,
on.
and even though we want to be as authentic as we're able, and the flavors and the final product is what we're shooting for, I still don't want to be in the brew house for 12, 14, 16
right.
hours or something weird.
Nor do our brewery partners want us in their brew house
That's
for
right.
14 hours
Right.
or 2 days.
No, right, and
At least they make you brew the batch, then, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That's right. It's not their labor. So as I said, we're inspired by the Belgian traditions, and that includes the lambic beers of Brussels and the surrounding area. And so I was inspired by Jeff Sparrow's book, Wild Brews. I knew him from my time in Chicago, and he lays out kind of here's how they do it at Cantillon and other breweries like that. He interpreted what he learned when writing the book. And, we go with that, 40% wheat, 60% two-rowers, somewhere in there.
You even use their messed up 40, 60-40 recipe. Okay.
Yeah, totally. It's about that. Actually, ours might be more like 67-33 or something like that, but
Sure.
It doesn't matter too much. Lot of unmalted wheat in it. The neat thing about that too is I've got a good friend who's north of Eugene who grows wheat, and I can go to his farm and grab it. It's just in bags, and don't have to get that from one of our suppliers. So some more local terroir. And then we'll do this little step mash, trying to build this proteinaceous thing. One of the problems is on a 2-vessel brew house. One of our brew houses we use is 2-vessel. Another one is 3-vessel. And if you could build it yourself, one day if we build a brew house, we'll set up our system so that we can move liquid around to heat it up, bring it back. So I can't do everything that I want to.
Yeah.
And that includes, moving the mash over, boiling the mash, doing these things. So basically what I do is mash in 2 parts. I take about 25% of it. I put it through a protein rest and step that up with hot water. And without really vorloffing, I just pull that turbid stuff out. Actually, what I do before that is heat it up really fast to kill the enzymatic activity and get as much of that sort of cloudy, yeasty, mucky stuff into my kettle. And then I'll do the second mash right on top of that, kind of at higher temperatures in the 158, something like that, to build some dextrins in the malt. The whole purpose of this is to 2 purposes really: to give some nutrition for the yeast's the yeast and bacteria's long time chewing away, because we know we're giving it a bad environment to live in anyway. And then 2 is build mouthfeel and body.
Right.
Our beers that are mixed cultures, we shoot for no sugar left in them, because then it's easier to bottle condition when you know where you're starting from, and the Brett won't take it something that has a little residual sugar left and make a bottle bomb. So we want everything to get down to 0. But when you do that, you can often have these just like insipid, boring beers, which, can work, like Brian said, for fruit, but by themselves, there just isn't enough mouthfeel. They almost taste watery. And so I think that wheat and any adjuncts we add in there, we might add some oats in there, flaked oats as well. We want to build body into a zero Plato beer. And it's challenging, but I think our little...
And it took us a couple years to do this. I mean, when we first started, it's like that was our... we were doing single infusion mashes on these beers, and then we'd get it to the final product after fruit, and you're just like, man, this is so just like, there's nothing to chew on. It's just acid and fruit, and it really kind of forced us for Matt to experiment on this process and to dial this in. And it's gotten way better. I mean, you can have zero Plato beers that are still very full bodied and are complex and not just like one dimensional.
Yeah, and I think when people talk about the history of that turbid mash in lambic breweries, they, you don't need to do that anymore, and maybe you don't, but we've found that we do, from what we were making to what we're making now. And I think when you drink a lambic beer from Belgium, you're getting some of that flavor profile they built is from the malt, the brew house work that they did 1, 2, or 3 years ago.
Where does it go from that brew house then into your fermentation process?
So we, Brian, maybe you want to talk about the mixed culture that we typically add and sort of how we ferment that.
Yeah, so that's probably where it stops being lambic inspired, because we don't have it. Yeah, we don't have a cool ship. We've just started experimenting with leaving totes over next door in their orchard overnight with some wort, and so that's a kind of a work in progress. But we pitch a mixed culture. I mean, we just use I'm blanking.
The Roselaire.
Yeah, we just
blend.
use Roselaire blend on kind of all of it for the blonde base, yeah, and that gets us to where we need to. It's generally, again, in stainless, from primary ferment in stainless. We oxygenate it just the one time at knockout. Primary in stainless for probably 4 or maybe 5 weeks, and then goes down into oak. And it's not really mature enough for me to put it onto fruit until probably 7-8 months after it's been barreled down, to really know that the fermentation is pretty much done, and to know kind of where it's headed. And then, from there, it'll go on to either stay and become a blend of a mixed culture, just normal mixed culture farmhouse beer, or go into our fruit blends.
How do you decide, which fruit a beer might go on to, or knowing that a fruit is coming in, pick which beer out of your library now of fermenting or finished beer, that you're going to age something on with fruit?
Yeah, so there's a bit of this year, for example, we're getting I think 7 fruits in, and it's over the entire summer. So it's really like some of them come in clusters, and then it's just like, okay, I know that we're going to be fermenting like 70 barrels of fruit beer, so I'm just going to make a 70 barrel blend of that base fruit beer, and then that's going to go onto each different fruit.
Sure.
Right? And then
it's very efficient.
Yeah, and it's also just because, again, we're kind of brewing these things in season, and it's like, all right, this is this season's
you're going to have it all ready to go because when all the fruit's going to start rolling in.
Exactly, and it's like, this is this season's like fruit base, and we're going to go through and we're going to kind of make that big base, and then that goes onto the fruit. And what's really cool is like none of our fruit beers taste the same. I mean, all the ones you've tried today have all been the identical fruit base, and they're all, because we're not using pasteurized fruit or anything. It's like you're getting the terroir from the fruit as opposed to from the beer. Some from the beer, obviously, but there's some unique beers that you'll be like, okay, this is like really showcasing this flavor. I'm going to save these handful of barrels for this, or, but for the most part, it's just like the season's fruit blend, and then goes on to the various fruits.
Sure, it makes sense. Any other, processes or, ways that you finish after this process with your sour beer?
I think the biggest thing, you can talk about, Brian, is sort of the wine grape thing we've gotten really excited about doing, and how we've taken some wine processes and brought them into our brewery and used it with a lot of our fruit now, not just wine grapes. Yeah,
totally. So Doug always gives me a hard time. Our other partner gives me a hard time. He's always just like, you just wish you were making wine. And I'm like, well, yeah, kind of. So we get a handful of varieties in a year. And we really just are trying to do really cool expressions of these wine beer hybrids. And that's something that Matt did for the first time when we were at Oakshire. And that was like the one sour beer that we made there that I was just like, this is it. I want to make wine beers forever. And if I could have a brewery that only made wine beers and would sell enough to work, I would absolutely do that because it's my totally absolute favorite style to do. But a lot of it is like just wineries have been doing this forever, like don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so if we can really control mouthfeel and tannin structure based on how much skin contact you have, right? So you can have a red variety and just do a super light skin contact. Like we did a Pinot Noir Blanc beer. That's one of my favorites we've done. And that was Pinot Noir, but we had we just did a really, really gentle press on it and had it on the skins with super gentle press for like 12 hours and then pulled it off and then fermented just on that juice. And that was a really fun beer. And then for the bulk, like we're drinking Raindrops on Roses right now, which is our Pinot Noir beer. That is, I mean, it's just, you're making wine. So we go up, we get whole cluster fruit, from next door at King Estate. It's all biodynamic, awesome Pinot Noir, and then it gets crushed, destemmed. We bring it down here, crushed, destemmed. It goes into our open top fruit tanks. We knock beer out on top of it. It gets punched downs twice a day, and until fermentation's dry, and then we let the cap form at the top. We rack off the skins. It goes into malolactic fermentation just like you would in a winery, and we treat it. I mean, we just treat it like a Pinot Noir the whole process, and that's been a really, really cool thing that we've done, and we've gotten some recognition for it too at JBF for our wine beers, and that's been like kind of a awesome pet project for us. And then we'll also, at the end, you asked how we bottle them, so we'll use for the most part we'll use a simple sugar as our priming for bottle conditioning, but we've done some really cool stuff where we'll save Pinot Gris juice from the year prior and bottle condition with that. We've bottle conditioned with like muscat juice to give it a really tropical, fruit forward, that little add for bottle conditioning. And there's just like so many cool things we can do, especially with our neighbors being so friendly to us that they let me go up there and use their presses and their crusher destemmers and their forklifts and things. I'm spoiled. Thanks, King Estate. You're great.
Awfully nice. Take advantage of of that closeness.
Yeah.
Right there. Well, let's zoom out and what's the big picture look like for Alesong? What's the near term goal and what's the long term goal? What's success look like, and how will you know when you've achieved it, or maybe you have?
Working less than 60 hours a week. That's all I know.
Yeah. Goal number one. Goal number two is we want to continue to grow our club. We love our local fans, and actually all over the country. We have 22 states that we can get beer to.
Really?
Through our club. Yeah, it's not actually direct shipment. Tavor helps us out with that. Tavor, the company up in Washington, who does direct to consumer sales. But we can ship all over Oregon. So we have Oregonians who are in our club. We have a good number of people who really support us here, and we like the direct-to-consumer model. That being said, we're in several states and several countries, a small little amount, but we don't need to grow that so much. We want people to come and see this property that you're sitting at. We want people to experience beer on our patio, and really taste what we have grown here.
Yeah, the club is just the heart of what we do, and it's like, it's so much fun at the club releases because we work so hard on these 4 beers, and why we decided to release 4 of these beers at the same time every quarter. It's hard and it's a lot of work to get all these things together, especially after I told you that I tweak them up until the very end. And it's a bit of a, it's just a lot of logistics, but it's so fun to work so hard in the cellar and on everything we do. Cause we do things the hard way, and it's so inefficient how we do stuff compared to like big production breweries and whatever. And it's so satisfying being out here and seeing the patio just full of people that most of whom are not beer geeks. Like they're not into beer. I'd say the majority of our club are like, they stumbled upon us, or someone gave them a bottle of us, or the amount of people we have come into our tasting room that are like, oh, can I see your wine list? Cause I don't like beer. And then we ask them, we're like, oh, well, what beers have you had? And they're like, American Light Lager and Northwest IPA. And you're like, okay, you didn't like either of those. Well, we have a whole bunch of variety of flavors that are pretty good. And then you're like, well, what kind of wine do you like? Let me pivot that way. And like, here's a stone fruit sour beer, and here's a whatever. And we have this awesome community of people that are just so into what we're doing, and the farmers that we work with and everything. So it's really like seeing our club grow and seeing more people get bought into this community that we've bought into, buying saisons and barrel-aged sour beers.
Yeah.
Like it's really awesome that's growing and that's supporting us.
And our releases, we get 1,000 to 1,200 people because people can bring guests, a certain number depending on which level of the club you are. And so we over a 6-day period, we get over 1,000 people here that we do food pairings with. You get your flight, you get each of the beers, and you get food pairings that we prepare for them. We just came from a meeting of tasting this August releases food and beer. And it's going to be another great one. So we just love doing that. We love food. We love people. We love making great beers. And we can do that right here on our property.
That is beautiful, and it's a great place to bring this to a close. For nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. Fill like a pro with ProFill can fillers from ProBrew. Think outside the puree box with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Nanobrewers try Fermentus dry ale and lager yeasts in flexible 100-gram packaging. Europills from Canada Malting Company is made from the finest overseas low-protein barley available. And Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Of course, we depend on you subscribing to our magazine when that directly supports our ability to bring you this podcast each week. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, let us know this content matters to you, and of course, enjoy more great content from us through that channel, along with recipes and all other sorts of not to miss content. Brian, Matt, if people want to learn more about Alesong, where do they find you?
Alesongbrewing.com.
Yep, and we're on all the social media channels. Alesong Brewing at Instagram. We got a Facebook page and all those good things. I think we even have Twitter. I don't think we tweet much, but I'm the only
Is that still around?
Yes, I still use it. I'm the old guy in the company.
Yeah, alesongbrewing.com, and then /join if you want to check out the club. But come out to we have a tasting room in downtown Eugene at Fifth Street Public Market, which is awesome. We have some great lineup of beers there, and it's a cool patio. But if you want to come experience it, you got to come out to the country and see why we did it in the first place. It's pretty awesome having a beer out here.
Brian Coombs, Matt Van Wyk, thank you for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Yeah,
cheers. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.